The polio epidemics. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, polio, short for poliomyelitis, cast a shadow of fear across the world. This highly infectious viral disease struck without warning, often targeting children, and left tens of thousands permanently paralyzed each year. At its peak, polio epidemics were among the most dreaded medical crises in history, shaping both medicine and public health policy. The disease spread primarily through contaminated water and food, thriving in crowded urban environments. For most infected, symptoms were mild, but in severe cases, the virus attacked the nervous system, causing paralysis, muscle weakness, or even death. Parents dreaded summer months, when outbreaks surged, closing swimming pools and playgrounds as fear gripped entire communities. In the United States alone, annual outbreaks paralyzed more than 15,000 people by the 1940s. Iconic images of children in leg braces and hospital wards lined with iron lungs, massive machines that helped patients breathe, became symbols of the epidemic. The most famous victim was Franklin D. Roosevelt, who contracted polio in 1921 and was left paralyzed from the waist down. His personal battle with the disease brought global attention to the crisis and helped launch the March of Dimes, an organization dedicated to funding research and treatment. The breakthrough came with vaccines. In 1955, Dr. Jonas Salk introduced the first effective polio vaccine, followed by Albert Sabin's oral vaccine in the early 1960s. Mass immunization campaigns dramatically reduced cases worldwide. By the 1970s, polio epidemics in developed nations had largely disappeared, though the virus persisted in parts of Asia and Africa. The global fight against polio continues today. Thanks to decades of vaccination efforts, cases have been reduced by more than 99%, and eradication is within reach. Yet the history of polio epidemics remains a sobering reminder of how a microscopic virus can paralyze societies, and how human ingenuity and collective action can ultimately overcome it. The contaminated blood scandal. From the 1970s through the 1990s, one of the most shocking medical scandals unfolded in the United Kingdom and several other countries. Thousands of patients, many of them hemophiliacs, were infected with HIV and hepatitis C through contaminated blood products. It was a tragedy of negligence and cover-up that destroyed lives and shattered public trust in healthcare. The crisis centered on clotting factor concentrates, a breakthrough treatment for hemophilia that allowed patients to receive blood clotting proteins in an easy-to-use form. But these concentrates were made by pooling plasma from thousands of donors, vastly increasing the risk of infection if even one donor carried a virus. In the 1970s and early 1980s, much of the plasma came from high-risk sources in the United States, including prison populations and paid donors. As a result, when HIV emerged in the early 1980s, contaminated supplies entered the treatment system. Thousands of people with hemophilia were unknowingly exposed to deadly viruses. Compounding the tragedy, hepatitis C also spread widely through these products, leaving many doubly infected. For many, the diagnoses came years later, after irreversible damage had been done. The scandal was not just about the infections, but about the response. Evidence shows that warnings were ignored, patients were not properly informed, and safer heat-treated products were delayed in reaching the market. Families were kept in the dark, and victims often faced stigma as well as illness. By the 1990s, it was clear the damage was catastrophic. More than 3,000 people in the UK alone died as a direct result, while tens of thousands lived with chronic illness. Similar tragedies occurred in France, Japan, and Canada. In the UK, the fight for justice stretched for decades. Only in recent years have official inquiries acknowledged the scale of government and industry failures. Survivors and families continue to press for accountability and proper compensation. The contaminated blood scandal remains one of the darkest chapters in modern medicine, a disaster where the promise of innovation was betrayed by greed, secrecy, and neglect, leaving thousands to pay the price with their health and their lives. The Radium Girls. In the 1920s, a group of young women employed in American watch factories became the center of one of the most infamous workplace medical disasters in history. They were later called the Radium Girls, dial painters who used luminous radium paint to make watch faces glow in the dark. The tragedy of their story revealed not only the dangers of radiation, but also the negligence of companies that placed profit above safety. The women worked with a substance called undark, a radium-based paint. To achieve the precision needed for tiny watch dials, they were instructed to use the lip, dip, paint technique, shaping their brushes with their mouths, dipping them in the glowing paint, and then applying it to the dials. Supervisors assured them the paint was harmless, and some even playfully painted their teeth, nails, and clothes with it. But radium, discovered only a few decades earlier by Marie and Pierre Curie, was not harmless. The radioactive substance accumulated in the bones, emitting radiation that slowly destroyed tissue and marrow. The women began to suffer horrifying symptoms: chronic fatigue, jaw pain, loose teeth, and bones that crumbled under the skin. Some developed what became known as radium jaw, where the jawbone literally disintegrated. Others experienced anemia, cancer, and terrible disfigurements. When the women sought medical help, they were often dismissed or told their illnesses were unrelated to their work. The companies, including the U.S. Radium Corporation, denied responsibility and even attempted to discredit the victims. It was only through persistence and legal battles that the Radium Girls forced accountability. In 1928, a landmark lawsuit against the corporation brought public attention to the dangers of radium and established important precedents for workers' rights and occupational safety. The legacy of the Radium Girls is profound. Their suffering spurred reforms in workplace safety, contributed to stricter labor laws, and raised awareness about the dangers of radiation. They paid the ultimate price for their employers' negligence, but their courage ensured that future generations of workers would be better protected. The Cholera Outbreaks. In the 19th century, cholera swept through cities across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, causing waves of devastation that reshaped both medicine and public health. Before its cause was understood, the disease struck suddenly and with terrifying speed. Victims could go from healthy to dead within a single day, their bodies racked by violent diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration, and collapse. The outbreaks were among the deadliest medical disasters of their time, killing millions worldwide. Cholera first spread from the Ganges Delta in India, where it had been endemic for centuries. With the expansion of global trade and colonial routes, it traveled far beyond its origins. Beginning in 1813, the first of several pandemics spread across Asia and Europe, eventually reaching North America. Each wave left cities reeling, with mortality rates climbing into the tens or hundreds of thousands. The true scandal of cholera lay not only in its death toll, but in society's failure to respond effectively. At first, many believed the disease was caused by miasma, bad air. This misconception delayed efforts to address the real culprit: contaminated water supplies. In cities like London, sewage flowed into the same rivers from which people drank, creating perfect breeding grounds for the bacterium Vibrio cholerae. It was not until the work of Dr. John Snow during the London outbreak of 1854 that the truth began to emerge. By mapping cases around a contaminated water pump on Broad Street, Snow demonstrated that cholera spread through water, not air. His work, combined with advances in germ theory, revolutionized understanding of infectious disease. Cholera's impact went beyond medicine. The epidemic spurred massive public health reforms, including the creation of modern sewer systems, clean water supplies, and sanitation policies. These changes saved millions of lives and remain foundational to urban health infrastructure today. Though cholera has been largely controlled in wealthy nations, it remains a threat in parts of the world lacking clean water and sanitation. Its history is a sobering reminder of how poverty and neglect can turn a preventable disease into a recurring catastrophe. The Cutter Incident. In 1955, what was supposed to be a triumph of modern medicine turned into a public health nightmare. Known as the Cutter Incident, it was one of the worst pharmaceutical disasters in American history, and a sobering lesson about the risks of rushing medical breakthroughs. The story began with the rollout of Jonas Salk's polio vaccine. After years of fear and devastating epidemics, the announcement of an effective vaccine was met with relief and celebration. The United States quickly moved to mass-produce the vaccine so that millions of children could be immunized. Several pharmaceutical companies were licensed to manufacture it, including Cutter Laboratories in California. But something went terribly wrong. In Cutter's facilities, a critical safety step, the inactivation of live poliovirus with formaldehyde, was not carried out properly. As a result, some vaccine lots still contained live virulent poliovirus. When these contaminated doses were distributed, the results were catastrophic. Within days, reports began to emerge of children developing polio after vaccination. In total, more than 200,000 children received the defective vaccine. Roughly 40,000 developed mild polio, 200 were left permanently paralyzed, and around 10 died. Parents who had celebrated the end of polio suddenly faced tragedy, brought on by the very medicine meant to protect their children. The scandal rocked the nation. Public confidence in vaccines plummeted, and the government rushed to investigate. The Cutter incident revealed flaws in both manufacturing oversight and regulatory approval. In response, the federal government introduced stricter vaccine safety standards and more rigorous oversight of production processes. These reforms became the foundation for modern vaccine regulation, ensuring that such a disaster would not happen again. Though devastating, the Cutter incident did not end vaccination efforts. Public health leaders worked tirelessly to restore trust, and eventually, polio vaccines became one of medicine's greatest success stories. Still, the Cutter incident remains a stark reminder that even life-saving science can turn deadly without proper safeguards. The HIV/AIDS crisis. In the early 1980s, a mysterious illness began appearing in major cities like New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. At first, it was seen only among small clusters of gay men who were struck by rare cancers and infections that puzzled doctors. The disease soon became known as acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS, caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. What followed was one of the greatest medical disasters of modern history, a pandemic that has killed more than 35 million people worldwide. At its onset, fear and stigma dominated. Because the disease was first identified in the gay community, it was wrongly labeled a gay plague. This association fueled discrimination and slowed government response. Infected individuals faced rejection from families, workplaces, and even healthcare providers. Politicians hesitated to act, and funding for research lagged as the epidemic silently spread. The devastation was swift. By 1983, HIV had been identified as the cause, but no cure existed. The virus attacked the immune system, leaving patients vulnerable to opportunistic infections such as pneumonia, Kaposi's sarcoma, and tuberculosis. Mortality rates were staggering. Communities of artists, activists, and entire social networks were decimated. Families lost children, parents, and partners in heartbreaking numbers. Activism became essential. Groups like ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, fought to break through stigma and demand faster drug approvals. Their pressure reshaped public health policy, forcing governments and pharmaceutical companies to act with urgency. By the mid-1990s, the development of antiretroviral therapy transformed HIV from a near-certain death sentence into a manageable chronic condition. Yet the disaster did not end there. Globally, HIV/AIDS spread across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, with poverty, inequality, and lack of access to healthcare fueling the epidemic. Millions of children were orphaned, and whole regions faced social and economic collapse. Today, while treatments exist and prevention methods have improved, the HIV/AIDS crisis remains ongoing. Stigma persists, access to medicine is unequal, and the virus continues to claim lives. It stands as both a medical and moral tragedy, one defined as much by human neglect and prejudice as by the virus itself. The Ebola outbreaks. Few diseases inspire as much fear as Ebola. First identified in 1976 in simultaneous outbreaks in Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the virus has since caused recurring epidemics marked by horrifying symptoms, high mortality rates, and widespread panic. The Ebola outbreaks represent one of the most terrifying medical disasters in modern times. Ebola is caused by a filovirus that spreads through direct contact with bodily fluids. Once inside the body, it triggers severe fever, vomiting, diarrhea, and, in many cases, internal and external bleeding. Mortality rates vary between 25 and 90% depending on the outbreak and available medical care. Its ability to decimate communities in weeks has made it a global health nightmare. The early outbreaks in Central Africa were devastating, but relatively contained due to the remote rural settings in which they occurred. Villages were ravaged, with entire families and health workers wiped out. However, the 2014 to 2016 West African epidemic, spanning Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, became the largest and deadliest Ebola crisis in history. More than 28,000 people were infected, and over 11,000 died. Cities were overwhelmed, economies collapsed, and fear spread faster than the virus itself. The epidemic also revealed deep failures in international response. The World Health Organization was criticized for its slow reaction, while local health systems, already weak, were quickly overwhelmed. Stigma and mistrust worsened the crisis, as some communities resisted medical workers, fearing hospitals more than the disease. Traditional burial practices, which involved washing and touching the dead, fueled transmission further. Yet out of tragedy came progress. Global cooperation eventually mobilized thousands of health workers, and experimental treatments and vaccines were accelerated. By 2019, an effective Ebola vaccine had been developed and deployed, offering hope for preventing future epidemics. Ebola remains a stark reminder of the fragility of health systems and the speed at which fear and infection can spread. It is not just a medical disaster, but also a social and political one, exposing inequalities, testing trust in institutions, and underscoring the urgent need for preparedness in the face of deadly pathogens. Chernobyl's long-term medical toll. On April 26, 1986, the world witnessed the worst nuclear accident in history at the Chernobyl power plant in the Soviet Union, now Ukraine. A reactor explosion released massive amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere, spreading contamination across Europe. While the immediate disaster killed dozens, the long-term medical consequences have been far more devastating, creating a shadow that still lingers today. The explosion at Reactor 4 during a late-night safety test killed 2 workers instantly. In the following days, 28 emergency responders and plant staff succumbed to acute radiation sickness. Many of these men, firefighters, engineers, and soldiers, were sent into the plant with little to no protective gear, effectively sacrificing their lives to contain the disaster. Their suffering, documented in harrowing detail, became symbols of the human cost of negligence and secrecy. But the true medical disaster unfolded over decades. Vast regions of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were contaminated with radioactive isotopes like iodine-131 and cesium-137. The most immediate long-term effect was a dramatic rise in thyroid cancer, especially among children who had consumed contaminated milk. By the early 2000s, thousands of cases were directly linked to Chernobyl exposure. Beyond thyroid cancer, studies suggest elevated risks of leukemia, cardiovascular disease, and other cancers among liquidators, cleanup workers, and residents of contaminated areas. The psychological toll was equally profound. Entire towns were evacuated, leaving behind ghost villages. Families were uprooted, stigmatized, and left with deep anxiety about invisible radiation. Survivors often reported chronic health problems and social discrimination, compounding the trauma. The Soviet government's initial attempt to cover up the disaster worsened the crisis. It delayed evacuations, suppressed information, and failed to provide protective measures, leaving millions exposed unnecessarily. International outrage eventually forced transparency, but trust in Soviet institutions was irreparably damaged. Today, Chernobyl remains both a contaminated exclusion zone and a medical case study. While debates continue over the exact number of deaths attributable to radiation, estimates range from several thousand to tens of thousands, what is clear is that its medical toll extends far beyond the immediate blast. Generations continue to live with its legacy, making Chernobyl not just a historical tragedy, but an ongoing reminder of the catastrophic intersection of technology, negligence, and human health. Thank you for watching. If you learned anything, throw me a like and comment below on what you would like to see in the future. History never runs out of surprises, and neither do we. So subscribe and join me for the next dive into the archives.